Imagine a future where entire countries, billion-dollar companies, and maybe even individuals claim pieces of the moon, Mars, or distant asteroids. Who would get to decide what belongs to whom? Space might look infinite, but the fight to own it has already begun. This isn't science fiction, it's happening right now. The trillion-dollar question is simple. Who owns space? Let's dive into it. For centuries, humans looked up at the stars with wonder. Space was untouchable, mysterious, and endless. But today, things are different. With rockets landing back on Earth, billionaires sending tourists into orbit, and serious plans to mine asteroids, the question of ownership has turned from fantasy into law, business, and politics. To understand the story, we have to go back to the year 1967. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Outer Space Treaty, along with more than 100 other nations. This treaty is basically the foundation of space law. It clearly states, no nation can claim sovereignty over the moon, planets, or any other celestial body. In simple words, space belongs to everyone, and no one at the same time. It was written to prevent another Earth-style land grab, where powerful nations carve up territories. But here's the problem. The treaty was written over 50 years ago, when space travel was limited to government programs. Nobody could have predicted companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, or Virgin Galactic. The treaty doesn't explain what happens if a private company mines resources on an asteroid, or if Elon Musk builds a colony on Mars. Can those resources be owned? Can the land be claimed? That's where things get tricky. Let's talk about money, because that's where the tension really starts. Experts estimate that asteroid mining alone could create a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Some asteroids are rich in platinum, gold, and rare earth minerals, resources worth more than entire global economies. For example, NASA has been studying an asteroid called 16 Psyche. Scientists believe it could be worth over $10 quintillion in metals. That's enough to collapse Earth's economy if suddenly brought back. And companies are paying attention. Planetary Resources, backed by Google's co-founders Larry Page and Eric Schmidt, was created specifically to pursue asteroid mining. Even though the company later shifted directions, the idea of private mining rights in space is very much alive. Now, what about the moon? The United States, through NASA's Artemis program, plans to send astronauts back to the lunar surface this decade. But this time, it's not just about planting flags, it's about resources. The moon has water ice, particularly at its poles. That ice can be turned into drinking water or split into hydrogen and oxygen to create rocket fuel. Whoever controls that fuel could control the future of deep space exploration. China, on the other hand, has its own lunar ambitions, planning manned missions by the 2030s and establishing a lunar research base. So the race isn't just about science anymore. It's about who gets to use and potentially profit from the moon's resources. This brings us to modern laws. In 2015, the United States passed the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which allows American companies to mine and own resources from asteroids and other celestial bodies. Luxembourg followed with its own space mining law in 2017, hoping to attract global space startups. These laws don't claim ownership of space itself, but recognize ownership of what you extract. Think of it like fishing in international waters. You don't own the ocean, but you can keep the fish you catch. Still, critics argue this could create a space gold rush, where powerful nations and companies dominate resources, leaving smaller nations behind. And then there's the Artemis Accords, introduced by NASA in 2020. These are a set of agreements signed by more than 40 countries, including the US, Japan, Canada, and many European nations. The accords establish guidelines for responsible exploration, such as transparency, interoperability, and preserving historic sites like the Apollo landing areas. But they also include the idea of safety zones, where countries can set up areas to operate without interference. Critics argue that this is a backdoor way of creating territory claims in space, something the Outer Space Treaty was meant to prevent. Meanwhile, Russia and China have not signed the accords, instead pursuing their own agreements. So, the divisions are already forming. Beyond nations and corporations, there's another twist. Believe it or not, individuals have claimed to sell land on the moon and Mars for decades. One man, Dennis Hope, famously declared ownership of the moon in 1980 and started selling lunar real estate. Of course, these deeds are legally meaningless, but the fact that people actually bought them shows just how much fascination and confusion there is around space ownership. So where does this all leave us? Right now, the legal framework says no one owns space. Yet countries are passing their own laws, companies are preparing to extract resources, and new international alliances are forming. The truth is, ownership in space might not be about flags or borders. It might be about who gets there first and who has the power to enforce their claims. If we think about history, it's not hard to see the parallels. When explorers discovered new lands centuries ago, treaties and laws didn't stop competition, colonization, or even conflict. Space might follow the same pattern. Already, there's talk about military presence in orbit, with the creation of the US Space Force and similar programs in China and Russia. The race for space dominance could easily escalate. But here's the big twist. What if space doesn't become another battleground for ownership? What if, instead, it forces humanity to cooperate? The International Space Station is a good example. It's been a collaboration between multiple countries for decades, proving that space can unite rather than divide. The question is whether nations will choose cooperation over competition when trillions of dollars are at stake. So, who owns space? Officially, no one. Practically, those who invest, innovate, and take the biggest risks may end up controlling the future. Whether that's governments, private companies, or global partnerships remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, the answer to this trillion-dollar question will shape the future of humanity, not just on Earth, but across the entire solar system. And maybe, just maybe, the real question isn't who owns space, but how do we make sure space benefits everyone?